We're going to study romantic love today in literature. We're going to take a look at how romantic films have operated, and we're going to take a closer look and do an assignment where we're looking at romantic love in vampire films and how some of those things have developed over the last century, kind of culminating in the phenomenon of Twilight. And there's a couple of clips from a few films that I kind of want to show you the differences that have kind of developed in them. Then I want to go into we'll start with literature, romantic novels, and kind of their history, romantic film. There's a couple of films that I'm kind of excited to show you. There's an extra credit assignment for watching one of the entire films. And then I'll do a separate presentation on soap operas, K-dramas, and telenovelas. And we'll do an assignment where we kind of try to figure out the similarities and the differences in American soap operas, Korean drama, and then telenovelas. And specifically, we'll look at Mexican telenovelas, although telenovelas also exist in other countries like the Philippines as well. And what I want you to kind of look at are some of the similarities as we continue in our class looking at how simulacras work, how things become copied, and how these copies operate independently of the original. So let's get started. This is our kind of cover slide here again, where I'm kind of setting up what we're going to be looking at. We are looking at an image of John Cusack from Say Anything. This is a pretty famous, I think, image from the era of this guy pursuing love and kind of coming to grips with maybe the girl he is chasing down maybe isn't the best person for him, and unable to express his own feelings, he holds up a 1980s boombox and plays a love song on it. And I think that has become, for probably at least the millennial generation, a really shining moment in terms of how to capture love and how, rather than expressing your own words, you express your feelings through somebody else's in music. And this particular song is by Peter Gabriel. If you want to check it out, it is right here in the link. Again, in these lectures, if we were doing them in class, we would watch this, but I'm not so sure how the YouTube bots, what they'll do if we play too much music and too much of other people's stuff on our lectures here. However, the links are all live, the links are good. Now, of course, in romantic love, we had looked at the Greeks and we had seen kind of love poetry coming from Sappho's. And again, I didn't necessarily read any of the poetry, but a number of the poems are here in the link. And I kind of tie the love into Epicureanism, again, kind of living in a world of pleasure. And of course, we also looked at some romantic love coming from the Romans as well. What I haven't really set up for us, but certainly what I thought about when I was putting this lecture together, was a Middle Ages concept in Europe called courtly love and the concept of romantic love. So in the Middle Ages, the age of kings and queens and knights, and stories like Lancelot and troubadours traveling around the country on foot singing love songs, we have courtly love. So this would be the king's court. And in the king's court, of course, you have knights and you have all these other people supporting the kingdom. And it was kind of a common occurrence to have a crush perhaps on the queen, somebody else's lady. And you might write love poetry, you might flirt, you might have these ideas. However, to show respect to your boss, it is a kind of love that you wouldn't consummate. And kind of the concept of romantic love is a little bit like this as well. The notion of romantic love is that there's a type of sensual simulation in this romantic dance between these two people whose motive is the lover's progress and growth in natural goodness, merit, and worth. In other words, your crush that will never be consummated in the act of love, your willingness to become a better person, the fact that you love someone unconditionally, even though you may not get any actual physical fulfillment from it, is making you a better person. You are loving someone without the idea of getting anything back for it. And I think that certainly is an interesting idea that we do see in contemporary media today. So, the idea of romantic love. And we've all seen these stories. Some of you may even consume romantic novels and things like that. What does media tell us about romantic love? Well, there are some myths, of course, that I think we might find. Myth number one in romantic stories, that these two potential lovers are soulmates. And I think very often in these stories what we find is one of the potential lovers is loving somebody else and needs to realize that that person is the wrong person for them. And if they find this person, probably the hero of our story, that is the one for them. There is only one soul that is on this earth that is designed for them. And without that, they can never be happy. Another myth, of course, is once you achieve this love, usually through, in many, many stories, often it's from the kiss. When they kiss, that's kind of the end of the story, and we know that they're going to live happily ever after, even though probably there's a lot of bumpy roads ahead, I think, for any lovers well after the kiss or well after the consummation of love. Another myth is that love is random. Another myth is the grand gesture, that the only way that someone can love you is if you do these grand over-the-top gestures, like John Cusack staring at us with the boombox over his head, playing it for the girl that he potentially loves. That you have to do these grand things for someone to love you. They can't just love you for you. Another myth is love at first sight, that you see this person, it's a form of stalking, I think, is kind of what this somewhat becomes. And person sees this person and they pursue this person. Many movies have done that very famously. And then, of course, another myth is destiny, that no matter how messed up your life might be, once you consummate this love and find this love, you will be completed as an ethical, good human being, and then everything will work out in the end. There is no such thing as a mistake or divorce in these kinds of worlds. So they are, I think, very much myths, probably more so than true fact. Life is a little more complicated than that, isn't it? Romance novels. So the romance novels is a genre fiction novel which places its primary focus on the relationship and romantic love between two people, and usually has an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. That's why romance novels are so popular still today, even though probably most of these novels are being bought digitally rather than in paper. The other thing that we find in the romance novel is there's many, many subgenres. You have fantasy romance, gothic romance, historical romance, paranormal fiction romance, science fiction. In other words, every single genre that exists in literature has a romantic equivalent. And I would say probably too, most of these romance novels are aimed primarily at women. So these are not films aimed at men primarily, but aimed at primarily women. Women are the biggest consumer of this particular genre. So romance can have complex plot lines. From the past, we find historical dramas, faraway places, and usually the more exotic the time, the more exotic the dress, a lot of times I think the more successful these novels have a tendency to be. So instead of focusing on a love story, it's idealizing values and principles that may seem lost today in our world. And the idea of the lover waiting it out, suffering until the love finally is consummated or works out, or the lover that the person desires, their other relationship inevitably will fall apart because that person is not as good a person or right for them or destined for them, like our hero or heroine of the story. So what are some characteristics of romance novels? So at the core, the romance novel is about developing romance between hero and a heroine. The common characteristics are all over many subgenres, but these are kind of some of the things that we'll find somewhat consistently. There must be a conflict challenging the relationship that needs to be overcome. And generally, once that conflict is resolved, we're pretty much nearing the end of the story. We never find that conflict and then look at the relationship develop and then see this relationship fall apart into a divorce. That's probably not going to sell as many books. Stories are aspirational, so issues outside of the central courtship are limited. We'll have other characters and things like that, but generally we are following one main character looking for love. And very often, because the stories are aimed at an audience of women, usually the main character is a woman, and we're seeing it from her perspective. Romance novels follow moral principles, and good behavior is rewarded with unconditional love. So I think one of the things that we often find here is that, and a lot of times too, the stories are very, especially in film, we find that these stories don't end up in hot, hot sex. Again, they often kind of end with that first kiss. That is kind of the beginning of what we suspect love will be. Now, that does change somewhat with the bodice ripping type of genre that comes later. Of course, the reason that these stories are so popular is that they generally have happy endings. So, throughout history, as women's opportunities and roles have expanded, the characters and plot devices of romance novels have evolved too. There was a time when publishers strictly censored the content of romance novels, and premarital sex was relegated to rape fantasy. Heroines had to be virgins, and adultery was unacceptable to be included in romance novels. And today, romance novels we see have come a little bit further, where women, rather than being housewives or being somewhat helpless, they are much more powerful, they are career-oriented, and again, I think the romance novel has evolved as the role of women in society have evolved. So a little bit of a history of the romance novel. we see kind of precursors to the modern novel in sentimental love with the novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded by Samuel Richardson in 1740. This was a popular novel based on a courtship told from the perspective of the woman. And unlike many novels of the time, Pamela has a happy ending. So we have the story of a 15-year-old maidservant named Pamela Andrews, whose country landowner master, Mr. B, makes unwanted advances towards her after the death of her mother. After attempting to unsuccessfully seduce and rape her, her virtue is eventually rewarded when he sincerely proposes an equitable marriage to her. In the second part of the novel, Pamela marries Mr. B and tries to adjust to upper class society. So, this writing of Pamela is a book of letter templates. Richardson, the writer, has accepted the request, but only if the letters had a moral purpose. As Richardson was writing the series of letters, it turns into a story. So we don't have kind of the common novel here. Instead, we have a bunch of letters that ultimately are kind of formed into a novel. And then he's writing this not so much as, oh, this is a new genre of love story. He's writing it much more as a conduct book. This is how men and women should behave in order to kind of stabilize society. And also, I think one of the things to think about this is that here's a man writing about how women are supposed to behave in society. And I'm not so sure that that might be always the most accurate or best way to teach women what their role is in society, right? That has a real patriarchal kind of implication to it. Now, once the genre is kind of starting to be developed, we get kind of the blueprint for romance novels from Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice. Theme in her work is the importance of environment and upbringing in the development of young people's character and morality. Social standing and wealth are not necessarily advantages in this world. And a further theme that is common in Austen's work is ineffectual parents. So parents and their values and their desires usually are not an absolute way that our characters are going to behave. So in this story, a kind of very brief summary, the news that a wealthy young gentleman named Charles Bingley has rented a manor in Netherfield Park causes a great stir in the nearby village of Longbourn, especially in the Bennet household. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters, from oldest to youngest, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, and Mrs. Bennet is desperate to see them all married. Again, putting pressure on the children, right? And also in an age where you're not putting pressure on your child to be their own self, to go to college, have their own career. I think that there is an unsaid principle here that a woman cannot be complete unless she is married to a man. And I think in many ways that is a common trope in society. You have to remember, in the United States, before the 1920s, women do not have the right to vote. And the idea of this, and I think that the way that this was sold to women, is that, yes, you cannot vote, but what you do is you marry, and then in your household, you influence your husband to vote the way you want to vote. Okay, well, that still means one vote for 2 people. And in my opinion, not particularly democratic, and fortunately our country has kind of seen the same thing. So ultimately in our story, Mr. Bennet pays a social visit to Mr. Bingley. The Bennets attend a ball in which Mr. Bingley is present. He is taken with Jane and spends much of the evening dancing with her. His close friend Mr. Darcy is less pleased with the evening and haughtily refuses to dance with Elizabeth, which makes everyone view him as arrogant and obnoxious. And as things develop, and again, and the writing, I think the writing and this summary doesn't do justice to it, but the writing the conversations are very witty. And ultimately, I don't think I'll allow you to kind of read the entire story here. What we're going to find is that the characters are all kind of trying to find their way with each other. Characters at various times are falling in love with other characters. And ultimately, again, virtue is rewarded in the end. Holding out for what's best for you is rewarded in the ultimate end of this. And you can see I give you a fairly lengthy discourse in all of this. I do highly recommend reading the actual original here, though, because again, I think in many of these stories, trying to do a synopsis or a summary of these stories really doesn't do justice, because we're not looking directly at how witty the conversations are and the repartee is in all of this. I think that's ultimately the joy in the reading. Another one of the famous early stories is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And again, another story about the crossed love of a different time period in the 1800s. Of course, when we have these stories today, there's set pieces, costumes, and again, behavior that is very maybe different than the world that we live in and the expectations that we live in. But again, everything in here is about keeping your chastity, keeping your virtue intact until love finally finds you. Now, some types of romance novels. Number one is the category romance, or known as the series romance. And these are the books that I think are really, really popular. My sister is a large consumer of these kinds of books. So these books are serials. They share characters and similar themes and settings. The Harlequin books, I think, were the most popular books in my youth. Those are the ones I always heard about. And they're, again, tightly focused on a central love story, minor characters as part of the backstory. And early on, these all had a decency code, in the same way that there was a comic code a while ago, where there were just certain things that characters could and couldn't do. You couldn't press sex too much in these. And again, many of these stories never extended beyond the final kiss at the end, which was the signal for the consummation of love to come. So for these novels to work, they couldn't be too long. They're basically novels that maybe you could read in a day or two. And again, looking forward to maybe the next book in the series that might relate to the characters or the type of story that's already been sold. The second type of romance novel is the single title romance. So these are usually longer, between 300 and 400 pages. They're not always standalone works. They can be connected to other stories and characters. But they're generally thought of not as a long-running series. The romance novel in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, things are going to heat up a little bit. These aren't going to be quite as chaste as the earlier books are. The decency code is kind of going to go away. So one of the famous ones in 1921 is Georgette Heyer, publishing The Black Moth. It again is set back where the older books that we were just kind of discussing, like Wuthering Heights, back in the 1700s, that is kind of becoming like this romantic time. And in a way, it is, because we do often refer to this era as the Romantic era when we talk about the Romantic era in painting, of course, literature and music. Beethoven is one of the musicians in the Romantic era. I think the height of orchestral music, big orchestras, big sounds, lots of feelings. So Heyer's novels are inspired by Jane Austen. She is really the progenitor of a lot of these kinds of stories. And then these romance stories are now exhibiting maybe more 20th century sensibilities, even though the stories are still put into the past. Now, a big kind of movement forward, or maybe backwards, depending on how you feel about sex in books, is the new 1972 publication, Kathleen Woodiwis's The Flame and the Flower. This is the Bodice Ripper here, which is a type of female clothing. The principals kind of fall into the bedroom. The sex is so hot, they can't just take off their clothes. They got to rip the clothes off. And this new style of historical romance, we find now the women are independent, strong-willed, paired with heroes who are evolving from maybe being more selfish. And again, like in the earlier kind of idea of romantic love, the love of the female character is going to turn these kind of despicable men into compassionate, decent people who truly admire the women that they loved. And as wonderful as a notion as that is, I don't know exactly how much truth there is in the real world, maybe. Now, these characters are going to continue to develop in the 21st century. We're going to see main characters now of women, again, who are CEOs and maybe even more powerful than the men that they are pursuing, which is very different than Pride and Prejudice and Pamela, and again, those earlier forms of the book. Mostly critically, these books are looked upon as not particularly being great literature, especially when we're talking about the Harlequin romances and the serialized romances. Now, of course, Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, of course, is great literature, but generally not necessarily always the way that that works. Now, in the 20th and 21st century, we do find writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is receiving critical praise for his romance novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. And we're finding authors who maybe are respected in other genres starting to dabble into this genre. And in a way, we could say recreating the genre with maybe writers who are maybe more respected for the kind of prose that they write. And the last thing here in this kind of introduction to how romance novels operate, what I find interesting are the subgenres. So if you are into boy meets girl, boy and girl have conflict, boy and girl get it on and complete themselves through their love, which, is kind of a wonderful idea in itself, and maybe because it doesn't always exist that way in the real world, the fact that it exists in literature and fiction, maybe that's kind of a wonderful thing for us. So we find every genre of books has a romance, whether it's contemporary stories of working women. Of course, historical romance, I think, will always be part of this because that's the beginning of the genre. Romantic suspense, I think paranormal romance is kind of an amazing idea. This cover here with the glowing wolf and everything. So if you're into ghost and ghost stories, there's a romance novel for you out there. If you're into science fiction, there's a romance novel. There's also faith-based romance novels. And of course, in I'm sure many of the high school libraries that probably you attended, you could probably find the young adult section. And in the young adult section, you, of course, are going to find the romantic novel. Now, generally, young adult, the, hot, ripping your clothes off sex probably is not going to be included in readers who are under 18, right? But again, the notion of the romantic kiss at the end certainly is part of this genre. Okay, so that's kind of a very short kind of introduction to the romance novel. What I am more interested in for our assignment, rather than reading a romance novel, I'm interested in how the romance novel has formed into film. And what we find in romantic films is really all the plot devices that had been set up by the literature are now with living actors and sound and, again, like this simulacra of literature turning into film, which I think probably has a larger audience because it's one thing to read the stories and them to exist only in your head, and it's another thing to see them act out in real life and really get like a real picture of the settings in terms of the sights and sounds. So romantic films are something that is a journey through dating and courtship and marriage. The films make the search for romantic love, of course, the main plot focus, exactly like the literature. And of course, there's obstacles like finance, illness, discrimination, family resistance, all kinds of stuff, again, that exist in the literary form of this. And again, we're studying things like love at first sight, unrequited love, obsession, sentimental love, spiritual love, forbidden love, platonic love, just like in the Middle Ages, where you love someone from afar, and that is making you a better person. To love someone, maybe in this love for afar, you're helping them financially and secretly, and they never know it's you. Again, the idea that you become a better person through this. And I think probably in the last 30 years, probably we could say that the movie Titanic, although on the surface appears to be a disaster movie, it really is a love story. And there are some pretty famous moments in Titanic that I think are indelible in the audiences who've seen them. The chick flick. So the chick flick, I don't particularly like the term because it just sounds a little condescending to me, and I think it probably was when it first came out, but like a lot of derogatory terms like Dada or Cubism, maybe not Dada, but Cubism definitely was a term that was not a flattering term to Picasso's art, but ultimately becomes the term that we know it as, and we think of it as a positive term. And I think the chick flick is kind of like this too. So chick flicks, again, are appealing to women, particularly younger women, dealing mainly with love and romance, and they're often released around romantic days like Valentine's Day. You're always going to get romantic films coming out. And, of course, feminists like Gloria Steinem, they have kind of objected, like me, to this term, and the related genre term chick lit or chick literature. So this chick flick probably is kind of beginning around the time Audrey Hepburn stars in Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is a retelling of a book, ending kind of differently with a different lead character. Not exactly the same character, the same characters in name, but not necessarily the same characters in terms of their sexual orientation. So many chick flicks are patterned after the story Cinderella and other fairy tales. And we all know Cinderella, the poor girl who has an evil stepmother who gets a kind of magical opportunity to change her class and for an evening, meet the handsome prince. I don't even think the prince has a name. I think his name is just Prince Charming. He's so wonderful. He's just charming. And she dances with him. He falls for her, but she has a time frame before she turns back into the poor girl and leaves, leaving behind a shoe. And ultimately, the prince goes throughout the kingdom to find the girl that fits the shoe. And then they fall in love and get married. That kind of story is kind of what we find in The Princess Diaries, The Devil Wears Prada, literary classics like Little Women. Again, always we see kind of these similar tropes. And if you have a question in terms of why are they so similar, my answer would be to you, they make money and they work. And audiences, which I think what it says is that every single generation of young people, one of the things that young people are always looking for in life is love and finding their lover. And again, finding their best self through their lover. And of course, maybe the problem with life is that ultimately that quest to do that might end up in finding your lover, but then the realities of life, how difficult it is to maintain a relationship, divorce, separation, maybe finding other people you like better in life. Very rarely do we get the happily ever after, correct? So some types of romantic films, the historical romance, of course. Yes, we know the historical romance because we have kind of seen that already in literature. One of my favorites is the romantic musical. I do love musical genres, and in particular, I think the great films in this genre is Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, that stars Marilyn Monroe on the left and Jane Russell on the right. At the time that this comes out, Jane Russell is the bigger star, but Marilyn steals every single scene that she is in. Marilyn is absolutely radiant throughout this film. And I do have a link where we can watch the entire film for free. I'm offering you extra credit to watch this film. It's a comedy. And it's one of those movies that if I ever see it on TV, I always kind of, if I'm passing through, I'll watch it for a while. And what's interesting to me in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is this is a different kind of film here. These two women are not virtuous and chaste. This is not Pamela. I'm going to hold on to my virginity for, my husband. These women are hustlers. These women are powerful. These women are full of sex. And yet still, what we find is that they become their best selves by finding love. And they, maybe it's implied at the end of the film, are going to change their ways. So it's kind of a gender reversal of how, the freeloading, sex-obsessed man is going to become now singularly obsessed with their new love and the love of their life, and they'll never cheat or wander or stray again. I want to see if I can get away showing you a little bit of the musical number here of Marilyn in Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. Now, Marilyn is not actually singing the song. Again, with movie magic, what we often find in terms of really our great lead characters is very often when it comes to singing, they hire professional singers. I want to see you to see a couple minutes of this. This is the opening segment. So again, these two characters, they are lounge singers. And again, they're always singing about how much they love men. And look at the amount of men around her that she is wooing. And what I really want you to take a look at, again, is kind of how radiant Marilyn is. She has a quality on screen that when whoever is on screen with her, we just focus on her. And this is a construct of Marilyn. This is something Marilyn developed. She developed it through cosmetic surgeries. She developed it through years of rigorous study and acting. And she created this film persona that I'm not sure has been equaled here. So let's take a couple minutes of this here.
French are glad to die for love. They delight in fighting duels. But I prefer a man who lives and gives expensive jewels. A kiss on the hand may be quite continental, but diamonds are a girl's best friend. A kiss may be grand.
Okay, so again, here we are. This woman again is singing a song about, yeah, you know, love and everything is cool, but if you really want to win my heart, diamonds are going to get you in my dress, if you will. And again, what amazes me, even though that's not Marilyn's voice, is her complete mastery of the camera, her complete mastery of her persona and her sexuality that she is flaunting and selling. And again, this comedy is, I think, really, really an extraordinary film in its time. And if you've ever been interested in Marilyn Monroe or have seen images of her, this is a great way to be introduced to her. Another form of the romantic film is the romantic comedy. Again, like subgenres in literature, we find that in film, basically every single film genre might have a romantic equivalent. One of the more popular romantic comedy series, probably the last 30 years, was the Bridget Jones Diary. And in the Bridget Jones Diary, we are dealing with Bridget, who is in her 30s. She's single. She is imperfect, worried about her weight, and she is fantasizing about her boss, and then introduced to a childhood acquaintance that she considers to be foolish and vulgar and finds arrogant and rude. But eventually she's going to see that her obsession with her boss, Hugh Grant, that he's kind of a scumbag, and really the guy who is obsessed with her, and even though he might not be perfect either, maybe their imperfections together create their best selves. And I think for me, I think the first of these films I found to be the most charming, but I do understand watching the entire series. All right, now where we're going to take our assignment, and we're going to kind of go a little bit further into the idea of romantic films, vampire films. And this is because of the movies Twilight. Twilight was a youth phenomenon, again, really taking the possibility of romance in vampire films and highlighting the romantic aspects of them. I think in many ways vampire films have always had a aspect of romance to them. Now, not always necessarily equal romance, kind of creepy horror romance. So the vampire films really begin with the books by Bram Stoker, his Dracula film, Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's the one that kind of sets up these. And again, these are historical dramas. So we are dealing with the past in usually this Gothic style castle and these kind of aristocrats, these mysterious, reclusive aristocrats who turn out to be these blood-sucking vampires who need human blood to feed upon. And of course, the genre goes on and on and on today. Now, the earliest film versions include in America Bela Lugosi, the top image here, playing Dracula, a Hungarian artist who, theater actor, who played this role on stage and then is in the very first talking American film. Now, the American vampire film also had then British equivalents of them later on. But all of these, the filmic versions, are really based on a German film, a really amazing film called Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. This is a silent film here and a German version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And what they do is they try to change a number of the names and things in the story. And the film, although quite wonderful, is sued by Bram Stoker's heirs, and the court orders them to destroy all the films. So these films kind of drop out of the public consciousness for a while, but a few of the copies were ultimately survived, and these movies are now kind of, the Nosferatu is a well-known genre. So in this story, we have Thomas Hutter. He is sent by his employer. He's a real estate agent to Count Orlok. They change again the name of Count Dracula to buy a home across from Hutter's home. He finds out that this Orlok is kind of a frightening character, and the townspeople really are scared to death of him. He goes to Count Orlok's castle. While they're eating dinner, he cuts his thumb, and Orlok tries to suck the blood out of his thumb. And, of course, Hutter is repulsed by this. Now, of course, there are sexual overtones in all of this, right? The sucking of the blood, the biting of the neck, all these things that do have sexual implications on them. Orlok, who buys the home then, notices Hunter's wife, Ellen, says she has a lovely neck. He himself had been bit by Orlok and falls under his spell. At the end of the film, Ellen becomes the heroic character when she finds out and believes that the strangeness of her husband is not his behavior, but Orlok is controlling him. She believes he's a vampire and finds out that a pure-hearted woman can kill the vampire by offering him her blood of her own free will. And this happens at the end of the film, and while he's sucking her blood, the sun comes up, and in the world of vampires, the light of day kills the vampire. And I think there's a really interesting analogy to probably the opium addict at night sucking on opium. The drug addict hates the light of day. You know, I think there's a lot of that to it. I want to show you a scene here. It's called the shadow scene, where we see this frightening character, maybe the most frightening vampire, maybe of all of them in terms of makeup, how the shadow has this property to him. And then I want to show you a second film, a German film, I think my favorite film in all of the vampire films, Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979, written by, I think, maybe my favorite living director, Werner Herzog. My favorite Herzog film would be The Bad Lieutenant, The Port of Call, New Orleans, which stars Nicolas Cage, and actually turned me into a Nicolas Cage fan. His remake of the silent film Nosferatu is dealing with much of the same stories and characters, and of course, the light of day is going to kill our vampire. It's highly sexualized. You see the vampire holding onto Lucy's breast here as he's sucking on her neck. And again, the idea of a unwanted love affair, but still a love affair nevertheless, and perhaps a sexual love affair, is kind of implied in these earlier vampire films, which I think in Twilight we're not implying anymore. No, this is a love story. I'm going to show you two scenes. One from the earlier Nosferatu. I'm going to show you a couple minutes of the shadow. And then I want you to see Klaus Kinski playing the vampire in Werner Herzog. And I think the shadow here is also really, really fascinating. So first, let's take a look at the first Nosferatu. Here is the shadow scene. So notice that the vampire is a wraith. And I think the idea of the shadow, since we're studying Plato's forms, what is more real? The world of the shadow or the physical world, right? And notice that the horror that we're seeing on our heroine's face is from the shadow that we're looking at. Now look at how the shadow has now attached itself to her body, a kind of body horror idea here that she is being controlled by this shadow. Okay, this scene is from Nosferatu. So Lucy is in her bedroom, the door is going to magically open, and then the vampire's shadow is on the wall. Then the door closes, and then the next thing we know, the shadow is inside of the room. So there's this kind of magical way. The shadow, we don't see the shadow enter the room. The shadow magically appears in the room. And I think this technique in filmmaking is really, really effective that Herzog does. And then the great German actor Klaus Kinski is going to enter the scene. And notice how magnetic Klaus Kinski is in the way that he enters the scene, and then he just chews up the scenery in this scene here. Let's take a look at this. Look how similar her horror is to the original film. The gestures. Think about those gestures we had been studying in Greek theater. Oh, that's a great entrance.
You must excuse my rude entrance. I'm Count Dracula.
I know of you from Jonathan's diary. Since he has been with you, he is ruined.
He will not die.
Yes, he will. Death is overwhelming. Eventually, we all is. Stars spin and reel in confusion. Time passes in blindness. Rivers flow without knowing their course. Only death is squarely sure.
Dying is cruelty against the unsuspecting. But death is not everything. It's more cruel not to be able to die. I wish I could partake of the love which is between you and Jonathan.
Nothing in this world, not even God, can touch that. And it will not change, even if Jonathan never recognizes me again.
I could change everything. Will you come to me and be my ally? That be salvation for your husband. And for me, the absence of love is the most abject pain.
Salvation comes from ourselves alone. And you may rest assured that even the unthinkable will not deter me.
That's so great.
Good night.
So what we just saw there is, again, like the other stories where Dracula's like, if you join me, I'll save your husband. She's like, my love to him is unbreakable, even if he is a ghoulish fiend now. And notice that she uses the Christian cross when she shows that around her neck, that drives off the vampire. So once again, in these vampire films, they have an overtone of Christianity, and we see the faith or the symbol of the cross driving the vampire away. Really, really wonderful scene here, I think, by Klaus Kinski and also Werner Herzog's filmmaking. If you don't know who Werner is, he's a documentary filmmaker. He also is an actor. You may recognize him. I believe he's been in a few Marvel movies as well. Really one of the great filmmakers in our lifetime. And then where the whole lecture here kind of crescendos on romantic films, romantic horror in Twilight. So now we have a teen film dealing with high school and, of course, the troubles of being a high schooler and wanting to find love and being rejected and cliques and everything else. And especially here, we have the handsome vampire, the incredibly handsome vampire. And still the same kind of storytelling, but now updated and serialized into something that teens and romantic films can kind of really identify with. Here's a couple seconds of the first Twilight where we get the scene, I know what you are.
I know what you are.
Say it. Out loud. Say it.
Vampire.
Are you afraid?
No.
Then ask me the most basic question. What do we eat?
You won't hurt me.
Okay. So that very, very kind of short teasing clip there. What has changed in this vampire telling versus the other two is the heroine might fall for the vampire if the vampire is really, really cute. That kind of changes everything. And of course, the vampire here is part of a family of vampires, and they are trying to kind of not be harmful to the people around them, and they try to drink the blood of animals rather than humans. And ultimately, we are going to find love in this particular series here. Pretty wonderful stuff. Now, for our assignment, let me talk to you directly here as a talking head. So I hope this kind of really brief introduction into the romance genre in film we could have taken this a lot. There's so many different ways that we could go with this, but I thought kind of really centering on something contemporary and also something in the horror genre, and also how love and romance in the horror genre do seem to really work well together. So there's a video that I want you to watch. It's a short video on the rise and fall of the vampire craze. And then also, I want you, for our assignment, to tell me what the common characteristics are of romance novels. Why do you think the genre is so popular with readers of all ages and crosses into so many genres? Question number 2, what makes romance films similar to romance novels? Cite an example from both lectures that seem similar in characteristics. And then, have you ever watched a romance film? And what did you think of this romance film? Do you like the genre? Do you not like the genre? I would guess that there's some of you that are like ambivalent towards the genre, and probably some of you like, yes, I love romance films. An extra credit assignment here. There's my first extra credit assignment for the semester. For 5 points, I want you to watch Gentlemen Prefer Blondes with Marilyn Monroe. And I want you to find a kind of Barth's reading of the film. And I think for me, the myth that I find when I'm watching Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is that true love and marriage perfects one's morals and cures all of your ills. And I think that that might be a Barth's reading, a connotation in all of these, where that's not stated specifically that that is the underlying reason for these films, and yet that seems to be consistent. And as I've talked about, seems to be pretty consistent in a lot of literature as well. You perfect yourself, not by perfecting yourself, but by perfecting yourself through finding another person. I think that has some flaws in it, but again, it's a very common trope that we find in media, and probably is something that we should examine a little bit further. Now, do you have a different myth that you are thinking about in this? And why do you think the image and popularity of Marilyn Monroe still exists today? What is it? And when you watch this film, what do you see? What do you see in terms of, oh, okay, now I get it. This is why she has her image and her popularity still remain, even though she died in the early 1960s. Okay. I am going to now do the second part of this lecture on soap operas. And there's a second assignment that will go with this. So kind of continuing on the theme of romance novels and romance films, soap operas are the television version of this. And these were really, really, really huge. They're not as big today as they once were. So they are serials, kind of like, the serials that we see in Harlequin romance novels, where these stories never end. And some of these, like Days of Our Lives and General Hospital, they have been running every single day for decades. The stories never end. The drama never ends. Always over-the-top behavior. And these soap operas were made specifically for housewives back when, in early TV in the early 1950s, when most women were mothers and housewives and didn't work. So as they're stuck in the house all day, these were television shows aimed at women who were busy cleaning, doing the dishes, hence the name soap operas, and also almost continually sponsored by soap companies. So the soap companies are like, hey, women are always cleaning, let's make some entertainment, and then while we got their attention, let's sell them our products. American soap operas, there is never an ending to them. They just kind of go on and on and on. And I think in that way, they're very similar to comic books, right? How there is no end usually to the comic book, the Spider-Man world, where there's always going to be another comic coming out. So we might have storylines that conclude, but usually there's another storyline that's starting. And I think that works really well in soap operas, that you have several characters, and these characters you become invested in over years, and each one of these storylines is either starting, progressing, or finishing in different time frames to keep the whole thing going and going and going. So, kind of plots and storylines that we find. I have some kind of interesting links here, like a brief history of evil twins in soap operas. So you might find a character who starts behaving in the worst possible ways, and then you'll find the big reveal, and that it's not really the character, it's an identical evil twin who has kidnapped the original character and then has taken over their life and is behaving badly. And once it's discovered, then our character that we loved, we can go back loving this character again, because all the terrible behavior that they were doing was not really them. It's kind of a wonderful idea. So the main characteristics of soap operas: emphasis on family life, personal relationships, sexual dramas, emotional and moral conflicts, and sometimes, especially when we get into later soap operas, topical issues. We see those things especially happening in the 1980s, where the storylines are, I guess in the late 60s, as America is changing, the Vietnam War protests are happening, we're starting to find those storylines also in soap operas, because now the younger women are interested in politics and these things, and to have them in the shows also keeps the viewer into the show as well. Now, later on in the storylines, they're starting to run out of storylines. So we start to see things like characters being possessed and, other like supernatural things happening, because, hey, how do you write a story that goes on for years and decades and keep your audience? So a number of the serials and a kind of small history here of daytime soaps. All My Children begins in 1949. General Hospital. And notice that when it comes to romantic TV and romantic films and romantic literature, put a doctor in there, and we pretty much have an audience. We could look at television shows like Grey's Anatomy today and certainly find the same kind of tropes, right? Days of Our Life, As the World Turns, all have a slightly different setting that they live in, and yet all of them, I think, have similar qualities. The thing that I remember in college is that the viewers of these soap operas are really dedicated because they happen every day. So when I was in college, I had friends who would schedule their classes around the soap operas, so they could always be in their dorm room for their favorite soap opera, because they had been watching this every day for years. And then they had other friends that they would immediately talk about the new episode. And I think that's one of the appeals to soap operas, is having the friends who follow with you and having something new every day that you look forward to. So what happens to soap operas in terms of their overwhelming popularity on daytime TV is reality TV takes them over. And reality TV, I think, has a lot of romantic qualities to them, like in The Bachelor and stuff. Contests to find true love that I don't think really ever work in the real world, but work great on television. And whether you realize this or not, but really reality TV begins when O.J. Simpson, a famous football player, probably more than likely murders his wife. There is a chase on a southern California LA freeway in a Ford Bronco, and then the case was broadcast on television, and everybody watched that. And in fact, I probably watched that a lot more than I'd like to admit every single day, watching ultimately OJ being acquitted. So what they began to realize in terms of the producers who make these TV shows is making a soap opera with actors and sets and writers is very expensive. Reality TV is a little bit cheaper. And same thing is true with talk shows, where you have a main kind of host, and then you have some guests. You have one set. You don't need to do a lot of set building. Also cheaper. And then, of course, game shows too. So the success of game shows, again, having a host, having a very simple premise. You're generally not paying the contestants, and if they win, they get prizes. And these are the types of shows that begin to dominate the ratings on television, and soap operas kind of begin to disappear a little bit. I have a few slides where I talk about some specific soap operas. And again, I think in Days of Our Lives, what becomes interesting in the 90s are these kind of plot twists where we're seeing characters being possessed, being buried alive, love triangles, characters who are dead but then they come back to life. I want to show you a couple things here. That I want to show you kind of the difference between an American soap opera, what's known as K-drama, Korean dramas. And the Korean dramas, I think, have very similar qualities to American soap operas, but they are different in terms of Korean culture. The kind of ways that sex is presented, the kind of characters, the kind of clothes that they wear, and of course the kind of histories that we see in terms of cultural expectations, similar but also slightly different. So in Korean soap operas, they are really popular in the Asian world. So like my friends who are Vietnamese, they really like K-dramas, and they're also into K-pop as well. What we're seeing, I think, since post-World War II is we are seeing Korea really kind of taking over the world in media in terms of their television shows, their soap operas, and then also in their music. They have kind of taken the place of Japan of being kind of the leader in popular culture in media. And it's pretty fascinating, I think, how that has turned. And then the other genre that we're going to be studying in soap operas are telenovelas. And telenovelas exist in a number of different countries, but the ones that we're going to study are from our neighbors in the South, Mexico. And I have a slide here and some links that kind of clue you into Mexican culture, which is very family-oriented and has a slightly different flavor than the American soap operas. So I think the biggest difference in telenovelas is that they don't go on for years or decades. Telenovelas are all one season. So we're going to have all the same sorts of stories and dramas that we might have in American soap operas, but I think they're turned up a notch in terms of the explosiveness of them, and they're always going to wrap up in one season. So before we end the lecture here, let's just take a look at just a couple of examples here. So this is an American soap opera here. This is Days of Our Lives. And this has one of the main features in soap opera, a reveal, something that is a surprise that's about to happen. And this one here I find kind of humorous from Susan Banks, the reveal at the wedding and the horror of it. It's horrible, but I also think it's really funny. Here's 27 seconds of this.
You just talk! You talk!
Oh no. She's not beautiful. She's got awful teeth. Oh my God. Here's another one that kind of gives you a sense of kind of the drama in a Days of Our Life episode here.
Neurologists are stunned. They've
Just wait
confirmed
for
that
this
ear ringing
commercial
is
to walk
shrinking
by.
your brain cells.
Okay.
I shot Kate and I buried her in the cemetery.
Are you sure she's dead?
Kate, can you hear me? I'm shot, not deaf.
She will point the finger to you.
Shot, not
Sure,
deaf.
she never gets that chance.
That's amazing. I'm shot, not deaf. So again, here the woman was shot and buried, and the reveal is not really dead. Here is the beginning of a K-drama here. Again, similar in, I think, in a lot of qualities in terms of the romance and stuff, but maybe the behavior, which maybe there's some kind of bad behavior in it, I think it's a little more toned down than America. And again, kind of reflecting a somewhat kind of conservative culture in South Korean culture.
성아, 여기 앉을래?
아, 나 앞에 앉을게. 내가 눈이 안 좋아서.
무슨 말 같지도 않은 핑계를 대면서 굳이 내 옆으로 오더라니까?
여기 앉아도 되지?
앉아.
어제 라면 먹고 잤어?
아니, 왜?
근데 왜 이렇게 부었어? 살쪘냐?
죽을래? 이게 아침부터...
아, 맞다. 나 책 안 가져왔다. 같이 보자.
그렇게 놀려대기는 하는데 내가 괜히 오버하나 싶었지. 근데 날 셀래? 빨리 안 해?
하고 있어. 생각 중이야.
다 된 과제에 숟가락 만들 생각 뻔하지. 왜 하필 너랑 같은 조가 돼서...
커피 가져올게.
암튼 말 돌리기 선수라니까.
So I think this one's kind of wonderful. Something that you might recognize, the college student finding love and the budding love here. And again, notice the kind of somewhat bad behavior here, but perhaps true love may cause his character to change and he may find the best version of himself. And then the last thing I want to show you before I give you the assignment is this is a very brief version of a telenovela. And I think why in the genre I like Mexican telenovelas the best, because they are really tuned up and I love the over-the-top dramatizations.
Ready.
That was amazing. So again, just kind of a little tease in how the three of these operate. So this is what I want to do for the assignment. I have a example of an American soap opera in General Hospital, an episode. I have an episode of Single Wife. However, if you want to replace Single Wife with the K-drama from the lecture with the college students, if that appeals to you more, you're more than welcome to watch that. And then I found a website. So it was difficult when I was looking for kind of the things that we would watch for this assignment. I needed to make sure that I found stuff that had subtitles because, I don't know if you speak all three languages. So I wanted to make sure that we could translate them. And I had a hard time finding English subtitles for Mexican telenovelas until I found this website here. So this is a repository of like 50 different Telemundo episodes of telenovelas. And you can just pick one and then watch it. So it's probably about like a half hour probably for each one of these. So these are full telenovelas with English subtitles. I want you to pick one to view. If you click on the link and you get a screen that says 404 not found, copy paste the URL and the site will pop up with all the episodes. So again, we're kind of looking at this Baudrillard idea of simulacra, how there was an original in terms of the soap opera, an original template, let's call it. And that original template, I would say, are the romance novels, right? And the early romance novels that we were looking at. And then that template then turns into films, turns into soap operas, American soap operas, and then the American soap opera is then turned into K-drama, and of course the soap opera is also turned into Mexican telenovelas as well. And you can watch any one of these genres and not be aware of the original because these other copies have become their own thing. So that is, again, one of the principles that we're kind of popping up, and again, will pop up when we study music in the near future in rock and roll, where we see in culture this process of simulation that is always going on. Okay, so in the assignment, what characteristics of the romantic novel do you see in all three of these shows? Make sure to give examples. Your examples are going to show me that you're actually watching things. So make sure in our assignments you're giving me specifics. What unique differences do you find between romantic novels, films, and soap operas? Give me examples also from the three shows. What TV genres have replaced daytime soap operas, and why do you think that's happened? So we kind of already know that what has changed here. I want you to list that down, but also I want to get your kind of thoughts on why do you think that soap operas have been replaced? And then of the three episodes, is there one that you enjoyed most? Now, you might not enjoy any of them totally, but is there one that you found more charming than the other? Like I said, in terms of what we were looking at and what I showed you, I particularly liked the telenovela because the drama is really turned up to 10, and I just kind of love that in media. Okay, so that's going to be our assignments for the week. We'll study romantic novel, we'll study romantic film, we'll study soap operas, and we maybe also should be aware that the template for finding love has kind of already been started for us in the ancient Greeks and in the ancient Romans. And again, when I think of Ovid and his manual for love and how you're supposed to behave, there's a lot of things in there that relate to the soap opera and the romantic genre of film and literature as well. And again, like maybe what you could say is when it comes to the genre of romance, whether it's romantic poetry, romantic literature, that the basic template of trying to find love and trying to find a better you through finding love is something that has been part of human history since the beginning of writing and literature and theater, and is still something that gets reintroduced, and I'm not sure necessarily is evolving as much as it's kind of rehashing those basic needs. And again, those kind of basic tropes of, hey, maybe I picked the wrong person, but there's this right person that will allow me to become my best self. All right, everybody, I look forward to seeing your work this week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.